and I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. We're happy to be joined by our event partners at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. We also want to thank our series sponsor, Con Edison. NYLCV's Education Fund's mission is to educate, engage, and empower New Yorkers to be effective advocates for the environment. This forum is the third in our series on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or CLCPA. The series builds off an event we held about a year ago at the Sabin Center, back when you could actually meet in person, which provided a 10,000-foot overview of that ambitious law. The breadth of the law is stunning. The CLCPA legally commits New York to achieve economy-wide emissions reductions of 85% across all sectors by 2050 with a goal of carbon neutrality. Through this series, our goal is to dive deeper into how we're going to achieve those ambitious climate goals in a way that is both effective, efficient, and equitable. We also want to build public awareness, educate New Yorkers on climate policy, and develop recommendations for how to meet those objectives. We held our first forum in August focusing on offshore wind transmission, and our second forum in September focusing on buildings and efficiency. We will hold more in the future to talk about manufacturing, agriculture and nature, and other parts of the economy. The state is off to a great start with bold clean energy goals of 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% clean energy by 2040. This provides the platform we need to recenter our economy to be a green economy and clean. Meeting those standards will be challenging for sure, but is actually the easiest part of the plan. The energy sector is driven by industry and utilities, businesses that are used to being regulated. But today we're here to talk about transportation, the #1 contributor to climate change in our state and our nation. Transportation is responsible for approximately 36% of our emissions. And unlike in the energy sector, reducing emissions from the transportation sector requires people to change. And I don't know about you, but New Yorkers don't like to be told what to do or how to get around. So getting them to change will be more challenging than shifting our sources of power. And yet people have so much power to make change and see what a difference it makes. Earlier this spring, we saw a 25% reduction in pollution simply due to fewer people driving. Because we also know that pollution caused by fossil fuel emissions has a significant impact on public health, impacts we saw all too clearly during the COVID crisis. A recent Harvard study found a correlation between neighborhoods with worse air quality and poor COVID health outcomes. Sadly, many of those neighborhoods are filled with people of color and low incomes. If we want to combat these effects, we have to start by combating climate change itself. Because when the current health crisis is over, the climate crisis will still be here, and we don't have a long time to act. Given the enormous role that transportation has in affecting our climate, we can't afford to wait. We're already making changes. During the pandemic here in New York City, we have started to change the way we think about our streets. As we all know, real estate is a limited and expensive commodity in New York, and yet we give a whole lot of it to cars that are just parked. Through open streets and outdoor dining, cities are reprioritizing that real estate for pedestrians, cyclists, and restaurants instead of cars. New York has passed into law, congestion pricing, an NYLCV priority. When that's in place, it will discourage driving in the most congested parts of New York City and invest in improvements to our buses, subways, and trains. We know congestion pricing works to cut traffic and clean our air. After implementing congestion pricing in Stockholm, children's asthma hospitalizations decreased by nearly 50%. Experts predict that New York City will see a decrease of 2 billion pounds of emissions once congestion pricing is implemented. Speaking of mass transit, to get people to leave their cars at home, we need more and more reliable mass transit. That also means better designed bus routes and trains and plans to evaluate our public transportation continuously. And our buses need to be zero emission, which the MTA plans to do by 2040, but may get hung up on funding. And of course, right now, we really need some funds from the federal government to make sure that the MTA continue to operate safely. We also need to provide people with protected bike lanes to encourage alternate modes of transportation, including e-bikes and e-scooters. All modes of transportation need to be part of the solution to combating climate change. For the people who do need cars, we need to go electric. California has adopted or is working on a rule to limit the sales to electric only starting in 2035, and that's something that New York is looking at following suit on. And we're working on a public awareness campaign around the benefits of electric vehicles. New York has several programs to encourage people to buy EVs, including the Drive Clean rebate, but we have a long way to go to reach the state's goals of 1 million EVs on the road by 2025. There are only 56,000 of these on the road today. And to meet our goals, we likely need to have all of those vehicles be electric. But we also need to address our buses. That's why we're pushing for electrification of school buses as part of our Clean Buses for Healthy Niños program. New York City school buses alone emit an average of 113,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year, or over 1.8 million tons over buses' typical lifetime of 16 years. That's the equivalent of the electricity use of 276,000 homes. Transitioning to electric school buses would improve our air quality, protect children's health from diseases like asthma, and bolster the fight against climate change. The state must also make our trucks cleaner, and we're looking at joining with California on that as well. And these aren't the only things we need to do to tackle transportation emissions. There's so much more that we need to do. But all of these things are going to cost money or require incentives to accomplish. How are we going to pay for the initiative so that the transportation sector emissions are cut in the short time we have to act? And that's why we're here to talk about two green transportation solutions today. The Transportation and Climate Initiative.
I'm back on.
Alright, put your video on.
Put my video on. Yeah.
To guide our discussion, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this morning's panel, one of our partners, Executive Director of the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, Nick Sifuentes. Nick was behind Tri-State's campaigns for congestion pricing, the 5-borough bus network redesign, and electrification of the full MTA bus fleet. We serve on the Transportation Advisory Panel together for the Climate Action Council. Nick, welcome.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Sifuentes. I'm the Executive Director of Tri-State Transportation Campaign. I want to thank Julie and the League of Conservation Voters for organizing this event today on two very important and timely issues, the Transportation and Climate Initiative and the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. When the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was passed last year, the historic legislation made New York not only a leader on our fight against climate change, but on equitable solutions as well. The CLCPA commits the state to producing 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040 and achieving economy-wide net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This means that New York has the most comprehensive and ambitious plan to combat the greenhouse gases that are changing our planet. Now, it's our time to make these plans a reality. Transportation is the largest challenge towards meeting those goals, with more than 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State coming from the transportation sector. Tailpipe pollution is a prime contributor to unhealthy levels of smog and soot in our air, which has a disproportionate impact on low-income communities and communities of color. Science is clear that breathing in emissions can cause severe illnesses and premature death. Now, the two primary ways to solve this crisis are by taking cars off the road, which can be done by expanding efficient public transit options across the region, and transitioning all public fleets of buses, trains, garbage trucks, and delivery vehicles to be zero emissions and fully electric. Now, with the ongoing pandemic, the goal is not only to reduce the state's carbon footprint, but also to protect and benefit frontline communities. Ramping down pollution during and long after COVID will be critically important for making airborne diseases less deadly, as we now know, and as Julie mentioned, that polluting air and increased harm from COVID are inextricably linked. TCI and LCFS are two bold initiatives that will help us achieve our state's climate goals and also help generate revenue that will be invested back into building a sustainable transportation network for the region. The need to fund transit and clean energy has never been more urgent. And as the MTA prepares to dramatically cut service due to a lack of federal support during this national emergency, the time is now. I'm looking forward to our discussions on these and other climate policies, the implications they have for New York, and how we can best prepare for a climate-friendly administration in the White House. I hope you're looking forward to it too. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First up, in alphabetical order, James Bradbury is the Mitigation Program Director for the Georgetown Climate Center, which facilitates the Transportation and Climate Initiative. In addition to TCI, James oversees the Climate Center's work in support of state climate leadership and coordinated engagement with the federal government through facilitation, convening, and analysis. We also have Bruce Ho, a senior advocate for NRDC's Clean Energy Program. He advocates for clean energy, clean transportation, and climate policies, and is currently focused on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, modernizing transportation in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, and the New England Energy Grid. Ben Mandel is Northeast Regional Director for CalSTART. He manages CalStart's work on market acceleration for clean and zero emission vehicles and mobility solutions in the Northeastern US and Eastern Canada, including supporting NYSERDA in the implementation of the New York Truck Voucher Incentive Program. Porisai Kia-Ipen is a Director of Environmental Sustainability and Compliance at the Metropolitan Transportation Agency of New York, or MTA. She's responsible for taking forward the vision of a sustainable MTA across its 5 agencies and the development of MTA's long-term vision for sustainability, including renewable energy, greenhouse gas monitoring, and energy efficiency programs. Kerene Tayloe is a Director of Federal Legislative Affairs at WEACT and a social justice advocate in the areas of environmental justice, civil rights, and voter protection. She is focused on ensuring that communities of color lead and speak for themselves as we address the important challenge of climate change. And Floyd Vergara is the Director of State Governmental Affairs for the National Biodiesel Board. In this capacity, he manages the West Coast office in Sacramento, California, and manages a team of professionals responsible for government affairs in all 50 states. His expertise includes the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, climate change and air quality programs, renewable and conventional fuels, environmental justice, and environmental issues. Thank you all for being here today. Let's go ahead and dive in and get started. James, I'm going to throw the first question your way. Just to cue us up a little bit, can you talk a bit about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI, and provide an update on where it currently stands?
Sure, happy to do that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Julie, for the kind invitation to participate. I've been really looking forward to this as well. So the Transportation and Climate Initiative is a collaboration of state energy, environment, and transportation agencies in 13 jurisdictions, from Virginia to Maine. TCI states and Washington, D.C. have been working together actually since 2010 to reduce emissions from regional transportation. And the Georgetown Climate Center facilitates the work of TCI on behalf of the member jurisdictions. TCI has been focused in particular on developing a multi-state cap and invest program for transportation emissions since the end of 2018, following a series of listening sessions. And prior to that, there was active consideration and some public engagement as well of a range of other policies and strategies. Transportation, as you may know, is responsible for over 40% of total regional carbon emissions. Each of the jurisdictions in TCI have established economy-wide greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And in some states like New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, these goals are binding and legislative requirements. So to help meet these economy-wide targets, TCI is proposing to create a multi-jurisdictional cap on carbon emissions from the fossil portion of motor gasoline and on-road diesel fuels that are sold in participating jurisdictions. That gets you about 83% of the carbon emissions from transportation. The proposed cap would require a 20 to 25% cut in covered emissions between 2022 and 2032 and generate between $1.5 and $6 billion in annual proceeds for low carbon transportation investments, which obviously are really badly needed, as Julie pointed out, and as you all know. Each jurisdiction would have discretion regarding exactly how to invest the proceeds. However, the intention is for investments to focus on strategies, one, that reduce transportation emissions, importantly, and also two, on a September 29th webinar, TCI proposed to dedicate at least, that each participating jurisdiction would dedicate at least 35% of the proceeds to investments in underserved and overburdened communities to ensure more equitable outcomes. The details have been developed over the course of the last year or two. A lot of input through public meetings and webinars. Had a lot of really great substantive input including from some folks on this call, Kerene and Bruce and Nick and Ben and Julie and others. So thank you all for that. So it's great to see you all. So with that said, a lot of that feedback also we've received through TCI online portal, which is still open, still inviting input. I'll also note analysis to date suggests that there would be really significant environmental, economic, and public health benefits of the proposed program, well in excess of the expected program costs. And a lot of those health benefits come from reducing diesel emissions from trucks and buses, and investing in those low carbon transportation options have a whole range of other social benefits, including jobs, economic opportunity, I know we'll get into this later in the discussion. I want to emphasize that targeted investment strategies and complementary policies are going to be really critical to achieve the additional emission reductions that are needed to meet climate goals. TCI can't get us there on its own, and also importantly to meet equitable outcomes. And I'll just finish by saying we're quickly approaching a major milestone in this effort. There was a draft MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, published at the end of last year. And within the next few weeks, that you can expect a final Memorandum of Understanding to be released before the end of the year, and at which point the governors who are deciding whether to commit to implementing the program as soon as 2022 will be signing on. And that means that next year is when the model rule will be developed, the draft will be published, and then reviewed by the public, and then finalized early next year. And then individual jurisdictions will develop their regulations and legislation. So that's kind of what it is and where we are in the process. It's really exciting to be part of the effort, and we hope the jurisdictions involved are successful. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, James. That's great. And I want to encourage members of the panel to weigh in. If you have a comment or you want to add to something, please feel free to jump in. But the note you ended on, the individual jurisdictions and what's going to happen there, I actually want to pivot to Bruce. And Bruce, I want to ask you, kind of piggybacking off of that, what could TCI do to help New York reach its climate goals with regard to cutting the carbon emissions in our air and also improving our air quality?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question, Nick. And I do want to start, thank you, LCV, for hosting this great panel and giving us all the opportunity to talk about these really important issues. I think I'll sort of echo a bunch of what James said in part of his comments, which is that when it comes to transportation, we really need an all hands on deck approach. So, Nick, as you and Julie also discussed, transportation is not only New York's largest source of climate pollution, but it's also a major source of other health harming pollution. And, we face a lot of other transportation challenges as well, including lack of access to convenient, accessible, affordable transportation options, transit budget shortfalls, and traffic congestion, just to name a few. And no single policy is going to be a silver bullet to these problems. But within a portfolio of policies, a TCI program could be an important pillar that helps New York meet our need to transform transportation and improve people's lives and get us closer to achieving our climate and health goals. So, in response to your question, how could TCI help in New York? Well, first, to meet New York's climate law mandate of a net zero emissions economy by 2050, we have to cut transportation emissions. Everyone knows it. And TCI would establish an enforceable declining cap on transportation pollution that would help get us there. So, it would, get us, start putting this declining trajectory within this sector. Second, we need significant new investments to transform our current broken and dirty transportation system. And you and Julie both raised that as well. We need funding to keep our transit systems running and to expand access to affordable transit. We need money to convert diesel bus fleets into clean electric ones. And we need funding for a ton of other priorities, including things like cutting vehicle miles traveled by strategies like making communities more walkable and bikeable, expanding access to broadband, including in rural areas to enable more remote access and work and access to services. A TCI program isn't going to solve all of these transportation funding challenges, but it could provide a meaningful contribution, estimated up to $1.4 billion a year, that could support New York's transportation priorities over the next decade. Now, it's also, of course, really important that in order to achieve these benefits, the details of the program really matter, right? So to make progress on climate, the TCI cap has to be ambitious. At a minimum, it needs to require carbon pollution reductions of at least 25% over the next 10 years from the transportation sector. And the program could and should go further. All of the analyses that New York and the other states have done so far show that adopting a stronger cap under TCI will be more beneficial to climate, to our health and our economy, and it will create more good jobs than a weaker program would. There's every incentive for us to go bold here. How New York spends the money from a TCI program is also going to be extremely critical. Using these funds to support equitable solutions like mass transit has to be the top priority. And in fact, research from public health experts at Columbia, at Harvard, and other universities has shown that dedicating a larger share of these TCI funds to mass transit will not only help us achieve our climate goals, but it will create better health outcomes. And from that research, we saw that in New York, a program that does dedicate significant funding to mass transit, that does include that strong carbon pollution cap could save over 500 lives and prevent 1,700 cases of childhood asthma each year in New York alone within a decade. But again, I want to be really clear that TCI can be an important part of the solution to our transportation problems, but it can't be the only solution. You know, we need an equitable and ambitious TCI program that's part of a larger equitable and ambitious transportation strategy to achieve the safe and healthy and accessible and affordable transportation system that we all need.
Thanks, Bruce. And I want to pick up on something you just said there right at the end, which is, you know, TCI is incredibly important, but it's not the only solution on the table. And I want to talk a little bit about another solution that we're going to focus on today here. So Ben, can you talk a little bit about the clean or the low carbon fuel standard, what it is, how it would work, and where it currently sits here in New York State with the legislature?
Yeah, I'd be really happy to, Nick. Thanks so much to you and to the league for having me join this program this morning. And I really want to echo what Bruce said as well, that TCI is a very imperative strategy in our view, but we need an all hands on deck approach if we're to hit any number of the New York targets as outlined in the CLCPA, or I'll add a New York's commitment to the multi-state medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle memorandum of understanding that New York is one of 16 signatories to from this past summer. So a clean fuel standard we view as another component in that mix. And you can think of this as similar to California's low carbon fuel standard for those who are familiar with that policy. Effectively, it would establish a declining standard for the carbon intensity of fuels used throughout the state. And what this does is generate credits for fuels that are less carbon intensive than the standard. So think of electricity, hydrogen, biofuels, and it would create deficits for fuels that are more carbon intensive than the standard, namely petroleum products. So what the standard does, therefore, is it establishes a market wherein deficit generators can purchase credits from credit generators, creating revenues that can either be reinvested in the transportation system or to reduce the effective cost of lower carbon fuels. I think Bruce did a really nice job of outlining all of the reasons why we need revenues, especially at this point in time where budgets are challenged in the public sector like few times previously. So having all the ways on the table to create much needed revenues is critical. So my organization, CalSTART, is a proud member of the Clean Fuels New York Coalition, which is led by New York League of Conservation Voters. I'll acknowledge Julie's wonderful leadership for this campaign. And what we're doing in Clean Fuels NY is we're pushing for New York to enact a clean fuel standard through several channels. We've been working closely with the governor's office in hopes of including a clean fuel standard as a state of the state priority. And we're also tracking progress of companion bills sponsored by Senator Kevin Parker and Assemblywoman Kerry Warner. I'll note that the Senate bill has 32 co-sponsors, while the Assembly bill has 75 co-sponsors. So there is a lot of bipartisan support in both chambers for this legislation. Of course, as we near the end of the current legislative session, these bills will both need to be reintroduced in early 2021. We look forward to working with all prime sponsors and co-sponsors on seeing if we can encourage that to be an early priority of the next session. I want to close this segment by noting that the Clean Fuels NY Coalition currently consists of 54 industry, nonprofit, and advocacy organizations. And we welcome additional interested organizations, I should say, to learn more at cleanfuelsny.org and to join us.
Thank you, Ben. Now, Floyd, you have a lot of experience with LCFS. Is there anything you want to add to what Ben has said and anything you want to speak to from your experience seeing it implemented in California?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Really appreciate it being able to speak here on behalf of the National Biodiesel Board. As you said, I did have experience. I worked 32 years at the California Air Resources Board. I was program director for the low carbon fuel standard for a number of years while I was there prior to joining NBB. So, Ben did a great job providing that overview of the LCFS. I thought I'd provide a little bit more context into the why, the design objectives and considerations. So to better frame the, kind of the benefits of this type of program and how it achieves multiple environmental and public health objectives. So when we set off to design the LCFS, obviously it's about greenhouse gas and decarbonizing the transportation fuel pool. But it's so much more than that, and it doesn't get enough airplay, I think. But those kind of co-benefit considerations are important parts of this program and why it's so effective. Beyond decarbonizing, there's also the objective of improving air quality, reducing petroleum dependency and increasing energy security, transforming and diversifying the transportation fuel pool, and then finally incenting investments in new fuels and industries and creating jobs. Let me go a little bit more into each of those. So in my 32 years at CARB, I worked on at least probably a dozen or more major regulations covering ocean-going ships, other mobile sources, stationary sources, and area sources. I can say honestly that the LCFS is the single most effective program I've ever worked on at CARB. It checks off so many boxes. In terms of decarbonizing, it's reduced GHGs in California by 69 million metric tons since 2011. Air quality improvements, the whole purpose, or one of the purposes of the program, as I mentioned, is to incentivize a variety of alternative fuels. Across the board, those alternative fuels are cleaner than gasoline and diesel. For example, looking at our products, biodiesel and renewable diesel, you can reduce GHGs by 79% or more, diesel particulate matter by 50 to 80%, and carbon monoxide by over 40%. Those are important, and we'll talk a little bit more about electrification, but on the heavy duty side of things, those are important, particularly if you get those benefits in and around the disadvantaged and environmental justice communities that surround high diesel use facilities like ports and rail yards, logistics centers, and things like that. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in terms of kind of the timing of it all. Petroleum dependency, biomass-based diesel has displaced, is on track to displace 1 billion gallons of petroleum diesel this year. And we have displaced over 3.3 billion gallons of petroleum diesel since 2011. Transformation, back at the start of the program in 2011, you basically had fossil gasoline and diesel, and the only alternative fuel that was, measurable was ethanol. Fast forward to 2019, and you have commonly available biodiesel, renewable natural gas, and increasing amounts of hydrogen and electricity, among other alternative fuels. So definitely the fuel pool has been transformed and continues to transform. And then in terms of investments, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, have been invested in alternative fuels to meet that market signal that the LCFS puts out there. Since the adoption of the LCFS, California has seen development in our industry of 9 biodiesel facilities and 1 renewable diesel plant. It supports 4,400 full-time jobs just in our sector, $156 million in wages. And overall, the LCFS has created an estimated 38,000 jobs. So as you can see, it checks off a whole host of different objectives just by targeting transportation GHGs.
Thank you, Floyd. That's a really helpful look at the impact that the LCFS has had in California and that hopefully we can do here. I want to pivot back to TCI and talk a little bit more about that, and specifically, Kerene, I'd like to turn to you, and I want to ask you if you can talk about some of the concerns that environmental justice groups have raised with TCI and other market-based policies like it, and talk a little bit about that, and if you see, any daylight here or any bridge that can be built.
Thank you. And of course, I wanted to thank New York LCB for the opportunity to share WEAC's perspective. And I will say the concern for many environmental justice communities and organizations with TCI begins simply with the process. The majority of the decisions of the who, what, where, and how were made over the course of 10 years with very little consideration of the experience or inclusion of communities and stakeholders who are now being effectively asked to rubber stamp this cap and invest program. At the core of WEAC's work over the 32 years that we've been in existence has been a pushback to these kinds of flawed methodologies and policy creation to ensure that communities of color and low-income communities can meaningfully engage in the creation of sound, equitable environmental practices and policies. So to do that, we typically affirm and constantly affirm the James Principles for Democratic Organizing that was created in 1996, demanding that we be inclusive, emphasize bottom-up organizing, letting people speak for themselves, working together in solidarity and mutuality, building just relationships amongst ourselves, and making a commitment to self-transformation. And so there's no dispute that transportation is one of New York's largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. But long before the broader conversation on climate change and emissions, transportation was and is a civil rights issue for our communities. In New York City, the state, and even broadly in the country, historically, transportation planning decisions and infrastructure development has systemically created inequities in how we get around, and it impacts homes differently and also impacts our health. Black and Latino homes are more likely to live in high traffic density areas than white people. Black and Latino students are more likely to attend a school near a major roadway than white students. This is experienced for us firsthand in New York with WEAC service area, where 6 out of MTA's 7 Manhattan bus depots are located north of 100th Street. As a result, our neighborhoods suffer from the highest rates of asthma in Manhattan. And so organizationally, as it relates to cap and trade, WEAC opposes cap and trade as these market-based programs typically and consistently perpetuate pollution in our communities. Cap and invest is said to be a way to address and reduce harmful pollution, but it's not clear if it truly can address the environmental harm that environmental justice communities are experiencing. Recent research from the University of California, Berkeley has found that even California's cap and trade program, which is typically lauded as a great example, has not yielded improvements in environmental equity with respect to health damaging co-pollutant emissions. So when will these complementary policies be implemented to offset the transportation sector related pollution? Another concern too is the funds that are created by TCI. The investment promises of TCI will likely be experienced as a tax that will be passed on to drivers, many of who are already experiencing financial hardship, but even more so to our community who are already crushed by high energy bills and the uncertainty of what's next in terms of how we'll be responding to the COVID crisis. 14% of Black households' pre-tax income is spent on transportation, and Black workers typically have the longest average public transportation commute time. So all of these things really make how environmental justice communities and WEAC specifically, how we're interacting with TCI very cautious. We want to engage. We know that it's necessary to be at the table, but it's a challenge when we're starting from a place where we haven't been included throughout the entire process. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerene. I really appreciate that perspective and share a lot of those concerns. And I'm hoping over the development of the program, many of the questions and concerns you raised can be figured out collectively, but that's a big effort. I do want to talk a little bit, and Corey, I'm going to turn to you. The MTA has obviously just announced some potential major cuts coming down the road. These are both programs that we're talking about today that could raise revenues that could be dedicated to the MTA for some of the programs that you lead. Can you talk a little bit about the MTA's long-term goals around energy efficiency and electrification of the fleet?
First, I have to unmute myself, sorry.
There you go.
So thank you very much. Thank you. I'm honored to be a part of this wonderful panel. Everybody seems to be so very eloquently talking about, energy and efficiency. And we are we always seem to have our head in the sand because we can't seem to kind of get out of this issues that we end up having with this mass transit with the MTA. And I want to talk a little bit about MTA, and I'm sure all of you are from New York and you know what MTA is, but just to give you a magnitude of what MTA covers and what MTA does is we have about 2,000 miles of track. We cover about 5,000 square miles of territory, and it's not just New York City because, as most of you know, we have commuter railroads that go north and east. And Kerene talked about bus depots. We have 6,000 buses, and yes, a whole lot of them out of up in the northern part. And so there are things that we've been looking at. And one of the things I would say, though, MTA moves both, including the buses, the commuter railroads, and the subway. It moves about 9 million people a day. Not today, not this year maybe, but in general. And what that basically means is that, and we have done an analysis and we have done a calculation through APTA and through the TCR, is that by being MTA, by being mass transit, MTA puts in about 2 million metric tons of greenhouse gas into the environment. But by being mass transit and by stopping the amount of people that would have otherwise driven, we take off about 19 million metric tons. So the avoidance of carbon by being a mass transit, which is analyzed, and it's a data point being 17 million metric tons that comes out of New York's environment annually. So that in itself is a huge environmental contribution, for a clean environment. Second is I want to talk a little bit about I think our energy efficiency efforts, and was that part of your question?
Yeah, it was definitely. We'd love to have you address that.
So we've basically been, my department came into existence in 2008 at the MTA headquarters, but long before that, there have been environmental and energy efficiency projects, initiatives going on all over MTA at all of the agencies. So one of the things, and we work very closely with NYSERDA, with NYPA, is our power provider, with the governor's office, of course, and any of the initiatives that comes out, Build Smart New York, Executive Order 88, etc. Talking about our bus fleets, we are I'm sure you know, and I'm sure Kerene knows, actually we have this plan of electrifying our bus fleet. So we started last year. We have 6,000 buses, and they go all over New York, and part of it is towards, some of Long Island. Is that it's not something that we could just say, we're just going to start buying electric buses. So a lot of studies and analysis went into it. So last year we actually started with 2 pilots. So we bought 10 buses from one company and 10 buses from another company. They were running in Brooklyn, running in Manhattan, running in Upper Manhattan. This year we actually purchased, earlier this year, we actually purchased additional 15 articulated buses, which we now own. It's not a pilot. And our plan was to go into buying 500 buses in this capital program, which is 2024, and which we right now not sure how it's going to happen. But the plan is, if miraculously all the money comes back, the plan is basically by 2039, 2040, to have our entire fleet electrified. 6,000 buses electrified. And that is not really throwing out, the clean diesel buses that we have, because our buses we have the largest clean diesel fuel bus fleet in the country. So that is running all our clean diesel buses to the end of its useful life. So that's one. The second part, again, is connected to the bus depot. We have started looking at, and this is an initiative just out of my office that we've been looking at, since we have a lot of facilities, specifically not just bus depots, but also shops and yards and workshops all over, from all the way up from Poughkeepsie down, is that we have large square footage of roof. So one of the things that we've started looking at is how we can use this roof real estate without becoming an energy generator, because we are not in the business of generating energy. We're in the business of moving people. So we've started putting out, we are actually testing the market with a few of the bus depots right now, is trying to see if energy developers would come in, renewable energy developers would come in, make a deal, make an agreement with us, a 10-year agreement, to see if they could start putting on solar panels take the energy and just pay us a rent, basically, nothing else. And with the energy providers, NYPA or CONED, wherever these facilities that start to get going, we haven't gotten anywhere yet. The RFP was out and it kind of stayed there because we didn't have money to go through procurement. So right now, that's what we are looking at. So the energy generated, the idea is that energy generated from these solar panels on the roofs will go into the grid. We had started talking, it actually started with a community-based organization from Brooklyn called Uprose, who came to us and says, hey, you know, give us your roof at Jackie Gleason Bus Depot in Brooklyn and we'll put some solar panel and we'll take the energy and we'll kind of distribute it among the people who live near it. And obviously, being a public agency, we can't just do something to cater to one particular community. So we took that idea and we spread it all across. And so if that comes true, it would be not something. I mean, we have Stillwell Avenue, which is a terminal station in Brooklyn. It is covered with solar panels, but that's all been rigged up to, and this was from 2006, it's all been rigged out to actually provide energy, you know, lighting, et cetera, to the station itself. So, but what we are looking at now is to putting the energy back into the grid. So that's on the, that's one of the things that we've been working on that. But in addition to that, with NYPA, we work with NYPA. We have an agreement with NYPA. We have this Governor's Build Smart 2025 program, and squarely in the middle of that is the Executive Order 88, which basically requires all government agencies to reduce energy usage by 20%. And it started in 2010, and the idea was to reduce 20% energy by 2020. And the facilities that these applies to, obviously it doesn't apply to our stations because it's, you know, it's kind of in the open and it goes into the tubes, but to our facilities that are 20,000 square feet or more. We have not only met already the 20% reduction for our large 20,000 square foot plus facilities, we have actually gone beyond that. And so we have, as a result of this, we have developed an agreement and an MOU with New York Power Authority that we work with. So, because they're our power provider. So what we do is we actually, they help us with a lot of energy efficiency when a generator, a piece of equipment in any railroads, the subways, buses, wherever they are, if they come to the end of their useful life, we then work with NYPA to put in energy efficient replacement. And NYPA actually pays us or pays us to do that. And then we pay NYPA back because we pay them for our energy usage. You know, we pay our bills to NYPA. So it gets tacked on to that bill over a period of 10 years. So we've had.
I'm going to hold you right there, just in the interest of time. That's a.
Okay.
And I also want to take a moment to, just turn to Kerene and say, Kerene, WEACT has been deeply involved in the process of electrifying and cleaning up the buses in northern Manhattan, which is, I think an effort we should acknowledge. And as a Harlem resident in particular, I also wanted to thank you for that work. But really quickly, I also want to turn to James. And James, one of the challenges I think that Corey mentioned a few times was, some of the federal challenges that face CMTA, which is something that we're seeing kind of, happen all across the country right now. Can you give us a little bit of context on where the federal government currently is on transportation policy? And also, if you can, then springboard off of that to talk about, why it's been left up to states to pursue regional solutions.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. And sort of picking up in particular on where new funding would come for transit. As you probably know from Congress, of course, it's hard to say what will happen, but transportation reauthorization is under active consideration with the FAST Act expiring this year. Senate passed a bill last year, includes some measures that would be beneficial for climate, but the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee released the INVEST Act this summer, which really offers, I would say, a new, more climate-friendly, equity-oriented policy for transportation reauthorization, including more funding for transit. Importantly, There's also the potential for stimulus, economic recovery legislation, which states obviously really need badly to get COVID under control and for a host of other really important reasons, including for transit. And so, transit services and jobs are being cut across the country when, of course, the opposite is badly needed for climate and many other reasons. So that's sort of from Congress, and potential funding for transit, obviously badly needed. It's really hard to say what's going to happen there, so I won't dwell on the politics of that. Another thing I will point out, of course, acknowledging that the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is going to have major benefits for what we're trying to achieve here, starting with electrical vehicle, federal vehicle emission standards were, of course, rolled back by the current administration, and of course, we'll see how those hold up in court. But the good news is that President-elect Biden's committed to quickly getting us back on track through executive actions to set new ambitious standards for light-duty, medium-duty vehicles, committed to also setting standards for heavy-duty vehicles, articulated a legislative agenda to restore EV credits. Biden-Sanders task force had a number of commitments and proposals on this front, including transitioning the entire 500,000 school bus fleet across the country to zero emission alternatives in just 5 years. So that's sort of some of the flavor of what we can expect and what's happening at the federal level. In terms of the role of states, I really just can't emphasize enough how important their leadership has been and will continue to be making steady progress on climate. Yes, we need the federal government to set strong vehicle standards. States have limited authority to do this on their own, and we need funding for transit improvements, as I mentioned, and also incentives for cleaner vehicles. But I think recent political history has shown us that state leadership is critical to creating durable climate programs and policies that maintain momentum. I mean, the political pendulum at the federal level swings wickedly, and it doesn't build those durable programs that we really need. At least it hasn't recently. Hopefully that'll change. But regardless, state and local governments are really either way, it's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to planning land use. This has been pointed out, and as you know very well, designing new infrastructure projects and maintaining the systems, which really needs more emphasis. And this is not going to change, and it shouldn't change. State and local officials are better positioned to understand and meet community needs, more politically accountable to those communities. And if I may, I'll say as a last point regarding TCI, it's sort of a regional program, a multi-state cap and invest program that's being proposed. For TCI, the TCI region has 55 million registered vehicles. It's 1.5 times as many registered vehicles in the state of California. It includes 72 million people. That's a fifth of the US population. So a program that caps and reduces emissions from all of these sources can achieve more than just 1 or 2 states acting alone. So getting that scale is one of the tricks and challenges with state policy, but doing it collectively, I think, can be really important. And what TCI is proposing would put sort of a regional mechanism in place wherein the individual jurisdictions would decide how the proceeds would be invested, including, with a certain dedicated amount of proceeds for, as I mentioned, for overburdened, underserved communities, which is actually at a level very similar to what the Biden campaign had proposed, a 40% minimum. In the case of TCI, what was proposed in the September webinar was a 35% of proceeds minimum, which of course is very similar. I think the same as what the CLCPA has, a minimum of 35% with a goal of 40%. I'll pause there. There's, I'm sure, more to talk about, but I hope that helps.
No, I think that's great. And Kerene, a lot of your work is down in DC and you deal with federal policy. Is there anything you want to add to Ben's comments, or what's your perspective on this?
We say all the time that elections have consequences, and the last 4 years have really articulated that. Just specifically related to transportation, the rollback of the CAFE standards, which no one really wanted other than Trump and the oil industry. And so right in the middle of COVID, April, they rolled back the CAFE standards. And you would think, when we understand there to be a clear connection between air pollution and transportation pollution and how that impacts communities of color, you would think that would be a really great motivator to keep something that effective in place, but clearly it wasn't. And now we're seeing the impacts of just a very ineffective and really combative House and Senate, where right now New York's MTA could potentially be laying off over 9,000 transit workers, and just so many budget pitfalls that are showing up just in terms of MTA's funding. And if we had been able to pass the CARES Act that the House had introduced, that could have been possibly $12 billion that would have supported MTA. So, we are, I guess, positive or more encouraged that at least under a Biden administration, where climate science is something that isn't debatable, but it's something that's appreciated, as well as just all of the data around COVID, et cetera, that we'll see more of an emphasis of climate and energy policy and transportation policy. We're of course paying attention to the INVEST Act moving forward, and also even the Thrive agenda that centers the experience of communities as it relates to COVID relief. But again, without a Senate that is amicable to some of these policies, we're going to still be in the same position where we'll have a House that majority of the House will push the bills forward that we need to make transit more equitable, more efficient. But unless the Senate's there to also pass it, we're just going to be watching and just waiting for something to die. So it is quite frustrating. But again, elections have consequences, and this is one of them. So please, if you can, support and get out the vote in Georgia. So thank you.
Thank you, Kerene. And yeah, I think you raise exactly how important it is that Senate power align with where the White House is if we want to see some policies at the federal level move forward, which I think puts added emphasis on some of these state and regional programs. So Bruce, I want to turn to you and ask a question, but before I do, we're entering kind of the last section here and also running close on time. So I'm going to encourage and then enforce a lightning round, where I'm going to ask people to answer as pithily as possible so that we can talk about some other things that I wanted to make sure we got through today. But Bruce, turning back to you, can you talk about some of the challenges to implementing TCI, and are there some gaps in the short term that can be filled in with other kinds of state and regional policies?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, the details of the TCI program really matter. And I think Kerene raised some really valid concerns. It will be unacceptable if TCI exacerbates disparities or fails to address the deep inequities of the current transportation system. Full stop, right? That's something that New York and the other states have to address if they move forward with the TCI program. That program needs to provide certainties and guarantees in terms of actual health benefits and investment opportunities in low-income communities and communities of color. And if the TCI moves forward, people in these communities need to have a direct and meaningful role in both the process of implementation and in decision making, including setting priorities for what kind of investments happen, where do those investments go, and what do communities most need to provide benefits. New York has a really key role here as the states work to finalize the program in playing a leadership role to ensure that the TCI program does include these kinds of safeguards and guarantees. We're expecting a memorandum of understanding, as James mentioned, from the states in the next few weeks. And if that memorandum is strong, if it commits to a program that's ambitious and equitable and will help us make meaningful progress on transportation, then Governor Cuomo should sign it. But we should ensure that that memorandum actually does include those standards. And even after the memorandum is signed, there's still going to need to be important conversations on TCI implementation in New York and in each of the other states. What are New York's investment priorities going to be? How is the money going to be used? And those decisions are going to require further open and accessible stakeholder processes and discussions for people to have an opportunity to weigh in. Some of those discussions in New York will be informed, I'm sure, by the ongoing discussions of the Climate Action Council and the working groups underneath that. But besides TCI, there are some other things that New York can and needs to do on transportation. I'll try to be brief here, Nick, understanding the time. So first off, I'll mention three. First off, as already been discussed a lot, clean fuel standard. A clean fuel standard will work hand in hand with the TCI program and other policies to drive increased investments in cleaning up transportation sector. It's an absolutely critical program for New York to also adopt. Second, as Ben highlighted earlier this year, New York signed that multi-state medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification memorandum. The next step is that now New York needs to adopt the California Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which is the mechanism that we need in order to meet that electrification commitment and achieve significant pollution reductions, especially in overburdened communities that are most harmed by the emissions from diesel vehicles. again, this program would work hand in hand with TCI, with LCF, Clean Fuel Standard, and other programs. And then finally, the Public Service Commission in New York has a really important role to play in ensuring that our state electric grid is prepared for those clean electric buses, trucks, and other vehicles. That includes ensuring that there are sufficient investments in grid infrastructure, and that also adoption of rate designs that will help us support and optimize the grid and getting those vehicles on. So these are all things that New York should be doing prior to, alongside, and building off of a TCI program.
Thank you, Bruce. So we talked about LCFS as one of those policies. Ben, can you talk a little bit about more how you think a clean fuel standard could help get more EVs on the road, and especially medium and heavy duty vehicles that run on diesel, which we know is a pretty harmful air pollutant. And again, lightning round, which Bruce was, kind of good at.
I'll do my best. So think revenues here, right? And I think California this week drew out this dynamic in pretty stark contrast, introducing what is called the California Clean Fuel Reward, a cash on the hood incentive for passenger EVs, so light duty, of up to $1,500 funded by utility revenues from their low carbon fuel standard, right? So that's a direct linkage between monetizing low carbon attributes of electric as a fuel and turning that into getting more people into EVs. Thinking a little bit more about medium and heavy duty as the prompt is, Bruce mentioned, New York can lead in adopting the advanced clean truck rule. In order to make that regulation viable, a beneficial total cost of ownership for electric trucks and buses will need to be established. And therefore, having measures in place that improve the ongoing economics and reduce payback periods for these higher initial cost vehicles will be really critical. So actually adopting a clean fuel standard is actually a prerequisite in many senses to being able to enact similar regulation to what California has introduced.
Thanks, Ben. That's very helpful and very lightning. Floyd, I want to continue with the clean fuel standard for a moment. So EVs are definitely part of the solution, like Ben discussed. But can you also talk about how the LCFS can help us move towards cleaner fuels in the short term? What types of fuels and what role do they play in finding ways to clean the transportation sector?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Great question. I love the way the question kind of tees up both a magnitude of GHG reductions and also a time element to it. I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way. When I have climate discussions with folks, I often get the question framed as, how do we get the most GHG reductions? And I think that sort of question misses a big part of the issue. And the missing part is the time aspect of it, right? Climate change is, time is of the essence. So you need to look at designing programs that get both reductions and do it in a timely manner. So, you have in your question kind of a short term, but I look at it as electrification is an important part. It's an important tool. I think it makes a lot of sense in light duty vehicles. I think in the heavy duty sector, it's a bit more complicated than that. I think at the Opus workshop this week, even Dan Sperling, the CARB board member and father of the LCFS, acknowledged the challenges in electrifying the heavy duty sector, and at the same time acknowledged the important role that biofuels will play in that sector. So, so to answer your question, I think, to extend the kind of all hands on deck metaphor that folks were using, I would apply that to the choice of fuels, and would say that this is really an all of the above sort of optimal solution. Electrification is important, but also biofuels is important. And they're important because they achieve those reductions, to the extent that they're drop-in fuels, they achieve those reductions right now upon immediate use with little or no modifications to the fleet or the fueling infrastructure and so forth. That's important in the heavy duty sector. If you look at the advanced clean trucks regulation that was mentioned earlier, that targets the new sales of heavy duty, medium and heavy duty trucks. And it's important to put that into context, right? That's a fraction of the total population of heavy duty trucks in California. only about, I mean, I'm roughly speaking here, only about half of which are registered in California. The other half are coming in from out of state. And that's going to be a whole different challenge in terms of regulating them and forcing them to go electrification. So to the extent that the states pursue electrification, more power to you. I think that's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of investments through mechanisms like TCI. And at the same time, while the states are pursuing those, I think it's important to make sure that biofuels continues to play an important role. As I mentioned earlier, or I think I mentioned earlier, like biomass-based diesel generates almost half of the carbon reductions in the low carbon fuel standard. So yeah, it's kind of an unsung hero, but it remains an important part. And to the extent that heavy duty sector requires that high energy density fuel, then things like fuels like biodiesel, renewable natural gas, in my mind, those are going to continue to play an important role. So again, to answer your question, the types of fuels that are drop-in, that achieve those benefits immediately, I think those are the ones that need to play an important role in these programs.
Thank you, Floyd. Now I want to move to audience questions because we have several that are great. And also one of them is actually a much better written version of what was going to be my final question for Kerene. So I'm going to go ahead and take this one that I like better. Kerene, and I'm gonna throw this one at you, but as audience questions often are, I want it to be a bit of a free for all if other folks want to weigh in. Kerene, so what are some of the alternatives to market-based mechanisms that we've talked about here today? And what does a program that centers environmental justice look like?
Well, again, we have typically been consistent in our position that we are opposing any of these market-based options. We see value in, of course, electrifying bus fleets. We really want to lift up the M60 project that MTA is doing in Harlem that impacts so many of our residents. School buses, is something that we also are concerned about. Investments need to be made, and we did do some internal conversations with members of We Act in our membership base to talk about what they would want to see. And the vast majority of them would like to see either more reduced cost around mass transit or free mass transit, investments in affordable housing that are closer to mass transit. So many of us, because of jobs and commutes, live typically further away from where it is that we need to go every day. So those types of investments, I think, are really important. The concern, though, the money does need to come from somewhere. And so the question is, where does it come from? But the reality is, who then is paying for it? And if it is going to be a fee placed further up the line, the likelihood again is still that it's going to be impacted and seen at the gas pump for people who are already stressed economically. And I will say, when we think about how New York will play a role if it decides to participate in TCI, the work has been done, 5 years around the CLCPA to really develop what we know and to be a really leading piece of state legislation that other states are following. And even the 35 to 40% recommendation of investments that came out of the work that was done in New York City or New York State is being in many ways copied at the federal level. And so we should, really be lauded about the work that New York has done, but the reality is for the other states is that type of infrastructure in place in terms of really understanding what environmental justice is, what equity is. And I think if TCI is to move forward, the time that New York has taken to really figure out and establish core principles needs to also happen in those other states. And that took us 5 years or so to do that here. And with the timeline that TCI has in place, how feasible is that in comparison to what needs to happen in 10 states to even ensure that this legislation will pass down the line? So, when we think about market-based strategies, environmental justice communities are for sure, concerned about it because we've not seen an example where it truly has benefited and led to the emissions reductions that we really need.
Yeah, thank you, Kerene. And it really does sound like, given the timelines that we're talking about here and how long it took to develop something as strong as the CLCPA, it really suggests that states need to follow New York's example if they plan on in any way being able to have an equitable process, but on the timelines that we need. I want to throw a question out to the entire panel here, and this is another one that comes from the Q&A. So a lot of climate policy has to be implemented at the local level. How would these state level programs help municipalities electrify their fleets, install more public charging stations, enable better car-free travel, et cetera? What does the state policy look like localized for people kind of at that individualized level? I will call on people if needed.
So I can offer, one kind of example here. I think that, one possible use of funding from a, TCI program in New York would be grants from the state to support local community efforts, things like, climate smart communities or, clean energy community type programs in New York, where, local governments and stakeholders could actually propose, this is the kind of solution we need in our community to make clean transportation options more accessible and affordable. And we'll seek to take state funding as part of the TCI money in order to support that.
Yeah, and if I could, I'll build on that.
Please.
And say that in the context of TCI, I mentioned the dedicated funding portion of it, but part of the September webinar that TCI hosted, the states proposed that each jurisdiction that participates in the Cap and Invest program would be committing to building on these sort of ongoing efforts, including, of course, in New York, the CLCPA process, which is really important. Similar conversations happening in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Virginia, for example, of bringing communities to the table to discuss where investments should be made. And sorry, so what the commitment was by TCI, proposed commitment was to establish equity advisory groups that would have a formal role in program implementation and ensuring accountability, identifying which types of projects or even, which types of programs and even individual projects are really needed by communities. So a combination of the sort of bottom-up influence it's built into the structure of the program and how it's implemented, and funding available from the state level. I think that combination together is really important and can be powerful.
Thank you, James. So next I have a two-parter. Pori, I want to throw part one at you, and then I want to throw part two open to the entire panel. So Pori, part one of this question is, in addition to electrification, public transit is a solution to reducing emissions from the transportation sector. So how do you see these policies that we've talked about here today helping to clean up the transportation sector while also driving people towards public transit? In other words, how is the stuff that we talk about here going to impact public transit? That'll be part one of my question.
Okay. Okay. So we are our state agency, as you know, and all of these policies and all of these mandates are like the first things that we strive to follow or we do, and some of them we get fined if we don't. So for us, for the public transit, and I want to go back to something I think Bruce said, is that when we start talking about how a public sector agency, for example, in our case, the public transit, MTA, starts to take these policies and implement it without connecting it with, and we call it, and we've always been planners and designers have always been calling it all the first mile, last mile policy, but it's a lot more than that. It's something that we need to engage the communities, because especially with MTA going not just locally, but regionally, it does require, we can't just say, well, the public transit has to go, we can expand it to go to in front of every household and pick up and drop off people. So, and that also, that first mile, last mile incentive has to be a part of these policies. And this is one of the things, and I think, Nick, you're probably aware of sitting at the CLCPA. We've been talking a lot about that, and I've been talking a lot about that. It's how to do that, connecting the dot. It's so very important, and it's not just getting people the ease of mobility. It's also employment. It's also financial situation, and in New York City, for example, mass transit goes everywhere. There are a few transit deserts, but outside of New York City, in New York State, there's so many problems. I mean, if you don't have a car, you end up not being able to get to where you need to go to. All those are the things that we have to look at. And when we look at policies, we at least at Mass Transit, at MTA, we've actually volunteered to follow a lot more than what the state or the federal, mandates us to do. So we volunteer, and I think Floyd mentioned greenhouse gas. By the way, Floyd, we are also been looking at, and we've been researching biodiesel, biofuel. So this is something that we are very interested in, and I totally 100% agree with what you said about biofuel. And you don't just electrify everything, so you have to have a balance. So we've been working on 2 additional things. One of the things we do is we report our emission on an annual basis to PCR, the Climate Registry, and we are a founding member of the Climate Registry. And as of last November, and we are coming up to a year, we committed to the science-based target of the Paris Agreement, COP21 alignment, and with the United Nations. And we are actually one of the 3, California being the other one, states that are government members of this from the United States. And we've just yesterday made our submissions of our target of reduction of greenhouse gas. So I think it's not just as a government agency, as a large government agency that we are. I think it's our responsibility not just to, follow what comes down to us, but to help. And I believe anytime you do these policies, you really have to do a step-by-step how to implement these policies. Yeah, places like New York and Buffalo and Albany are big cities, and we have very smart people. But when you go to a smaller town who wants to mandate these policies, you really need to provide them with some help in how they can go step by step. And generally, I see these policies don't clarify that. It's very ambiguous. And then you do all the work and you submit something and you say, oh well, no, that's not really what we wanted. So I think that's one of the things that these policies can do, is to be more clear.
Thank you, Pori. And you did a perfect job of teeing up my second question, the follow on to that, which is for areas that don't have access to good mass transit, how do the policies we're talking about today help those people too? So, ex-urban, rural areas, et cetera. Who wants to take that on?
I can take a crack at it, Nick, very quickly. And I think another area where our state transportation efforts would benefit from additional revenues is enhancement of first and last mile connections to existing transit services. MTA is a great example of this, but they're not the only transit authority in the state that's actively working to enhance bus rapid transit service. And we're going to try to roll out a few projects, including a partnership with Tri-State, that effectively place more mobility modes and options at the hands of people to reduce their reliance on single occupancy car trips, to make it easier for them to access efficient and effective rail and bus transportation options. So I think that's a system we really do need to invest in, to see where we can get shared and electric or otherwise zero emission transportation options like scooter share, bike share, et cetera, and even zero emission van pool solutions and circulators going to reduce the expectation that the further out from a city you go, the more reliant on a car you need to be, which is effectively a poverty trap in many respects for city planning.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, can I just add to something Ben just said? Ben, you're right. And where one of the things that I think when we talk about, we often talk about smart growth, and then we kind of separate it from transportation and mobility and electrification, but it's not so. And so this mobility is just one of the aspects of smart growth. And when you talk about public transit, it's just one of the aspects of smart growth. If you're going towards that economic development, reaching out to those people that need to get to it's not just because we need to get them, provide a taxi service to get them to a train station. It's also as to where they live and how that becomes, it's a transportation-oriented development is becoming so much more important, because it kind of creates a community, it creates a village, a town, totally independent and someplace you want to live, not just a bedroom community.
Thank you, Corey. Anybody else want to add in on this conversation around areas that don't have access to mass transit? I'll add one other piece here that we've been thinking a lot about, and that is aging in place and the importance of making sure that people can age in place with dignity, and the role that the programs we're talking about here can allow us to expand alternate forms of transit and transportation, especially paratransit in those communities. So I feel like that's an important piece of the conversation that we'll continue to have as part of the Transportation Advisory Panel to the Climate Action Council that Julia and I both serve on. But let me pivot to a different question here. And Ben and Floyd, I'm looking at you for this one. Are biodiesel and other low carbon liquid fuels compatible with existing vehicles and infrastructure, or are we talking about having to make a whole new infrastructure investments to make them work?
Yeah, great question. A couple of parts there, and I'll tie it to one of your earlier questions on the local actions. Fuels such as B20 and renewable diesel, completely compatible with existing engine and storage technology. So, nothing more than regular due diligence and maintenance as required by the storage tank manufacturers and the engine manufacturers. So, like I said, these are basically drop-in fuels. And so, a fleet operator can basically go out to a refueling station and purchase these, put them in their vehicles. They're going to get those benefits immediately, and they don't have to do anything other than the regular maintenance of replacing filters, cleaning out the tanks, that sort of thing that they normally would do with conventional diesel. And that ties back to your earlier question about tying local actions to the state policies. This is something fleet operators can do now. They can go 100% sustainable simply by making an effort to go out and purchase 100% renewable diesel blended with biodiesel in 80%, 20% blend, for example. That would get you 100% sustainability, completely displace your diesel consumption, improve your carbon footprint, and then get you those carbon reductions that are important for corporate stewardship. So I think that's a excellent example, and you can do that because the low carbon fuel standard in California has not had an adverse impact on the prices that consumers see at the pump. I mean, if you look at data from Energy Information Agency from 2011 to 2019. The 2019 prices for gasoline and diesel are at or lower than they were at the start of the LCFS program. So, you can interpret that however you want, but basically consumers of these fuels have not been seeing significant price impacts at the pump. So you can have your clean diesel and not suffer in your wallet as well.
Great, thank you. Ben, you want to add to that?
I'll just note very quickly that that exact mix, I believe that Floyd is mentioning, was adopted by New York City for a renewable diesel pilot within the last year or two, where they embraced 1 million gallons of renewable diesel mixed in, I believe, an 80% renewable, 20% bio blend, with the imperative of having domestically sourced and ethically sourced renewable diesel. And it was a drop-in fuel, right? It's an extremely large diesel fleet. It was not as though they were purchasing new capital assets for the storage and dispensing and usage of the renewable diesel. And I believe that is now supporting a larger scale procurement so that they can bid a new contract for renewable diesel product within their already very large biodiesel program.
Thank you, Ben. So, all right, we've got about 2 minutes remaining. I'm going to pivot and ask one final question from the audience. And I'm going to broaden it a little bit here. The question is, could a higher gas tax like they have in Europe play a role here? And I want to throw that open and resist the urge to editorialize about VNT, but say, what other kinds of solutions, broad solutions, blue sky solutions could potentially be on the table here, like increasing the gas tax, VMT, et cetera. Again, we've got about 2 minutes, so lightning round from anybody who wants to take that on, and I will stop you. James, you look like you almost
Yes, I'm
have a
about to
thought.
a word is about to come out of my mouth. You're right. So I was hesitating because I just want to be clear. What TCI is proposing is, I think they've been pretty clear. They are not looking to have a major price impact. So with the policy, the objective is not through TCI to set a price on carbon that is high enough that it fundamentally changes, how people behavior. Right, that obviously can happen. That is something that's happened in Europe with much higher gas prices. You do change behavior if prices at the pump are that much higher. What TCI is proposing to do is to set a price that's modest. So that's going to have some impact, including on where your investment makes for example, an electric bus more cost effective if the price of gasoline or diesel is just slightly higher. But the idea is to take the proceeds and invest them in options and alternatives that people want to choose, and people get given that opportunity. And that is really the way, through both, but you get VMT reductions through the investments and providing alternatives, and through a modest, cost will also have that effect. But I think the kind of prices you see in Europe just doesn't seem to be that there's a strong political appetite for that. And of course, as we heard from Kerene and others, there's a real regressive impact to higher fuel prices with, especially for communities and individuals who drive a lot. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, James. Actually, that's a perfect note for me to kick it back to Julie on. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. This is a fantastic conversation. Obviously a panel of experts who are deeply steeped in the work and very committed to seeing good outcomes for the region and for the country. So thank you very much. And Julie, we'll kick it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been terrific. I do want to point out we have a lot of questions we weren't able to get to today. We tried to answer a few of them directly. We will certainly try to follow up to the extent that we can, and we will try to connect people where they were interested in more information. I know there was a request to connect with Floyd on biodiesel in particular. So certainly we're going to try to follow up on that because there's a lot more to do on transportation. And we are going to be spending time moving very quickly to try to come up with a plan that makes sense and that takes into consideration the equity concerns, much like Kerene raised. I hope you learned a few things about the Clean Fuel Standard and the Transportation and Climate Initiative and how they and other programs could potentially work to green our transportation system. I want to once again thank our partners, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, our sponsor, Con Edison, and of course to all of our panelists who are here for this great discussion today. If you tuned in late or you want to rewatch it, we are going to be posting this video on our YouTube page, which is cleverly youtube.com/NYLCV. As I mentioned earlier, this is a part of our series on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So stay tuned for more forums just like this one. And of course, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for updates. And if you're not already on our email list, please sign up at www.nylcvef.org. Thank you all and have a great weekend and a happy, if small and socially distant, Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving.